When looking at the population geography, especially the population density of the United States, we can look at this census dot map and we can see particular patterns. First off, there's definitely a clear pattern as far as most of the population is found somewhere in the eastern part of the United States. In particular, we can really see this regarding close to or proximity to a major coastline. So if we look on the eastern coast, we can really see particular areas, higher densities, where we see darker clusters there along the east coast, especially along the Atlantic coast. Some other exceptions to that would be in the interior along the Great Lakes. And so although this map, keep in mind, this is not showcasing, there's no boundaries, there's no water boundaries that are purposely being shown, but nonetheless can be seen here when we look at where people live. And so just by putting a dot for every single person that lives, in this case somewhere in the United States or Canada, we can see particular clusters. The first most notable cluster is what we call the Boss Wash. This is from approximately Boston all the way down to essentially coastal Virginia, so down to Washington, D.C. in particular. Thus why it's called a Boss Wash megalopolis, which is essentially just a large cluster of urban areas in which they all overlap into each other. And so when you go up to this part of the area of the country, you're going to see dense urbanity. Huge amounts of people in a small amount of area, all here along the coast. Further, we see another key region, that's where we live, and that's around the Great Lakes. And so this is another population cluster with overwhelmingly most of the population somewhere in close proximity to the Great Lakes. Other things that pop up is you'll see cities that are along rivers, for the most part, also found in this particular area. The next large cluster would be what we call the Southern Piedmont. This is going to be mostly Charlotte and Atlanta, the two big cities, but it all is these surrounding cities that are somewhere close to Appalachian. They're in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains, as they would say, and so they are all in this area that's going to be continue to see growth. Knoxville, Nashville, Tennessee, Asheville, North Carolina, Raleigh, Durham, Columbia, South Carolina. All of those are these southern areas that are seeing continued growth in a population cluster. Further, we have another one that's what I call the coastal South. And so this is going to comprise all those coastal cities, all those places you like to go to for spring break, Panama City, Fort Lauderdale, Myrtle Beach. All of these places are essentially coastal, and you see a dense cluster. And these are going to be, of course, where you're going to see increases in tourism. So where a lot of tourism jobs will be found here in the coastal South. Another dense population cluster. Then we got this another cluster, what we call the Texas Triangle. It's a conglomerate of cities. For the most part, Houston, San Antonio, and Dallas are the key to that triangle. And this is going to be another key, fast-growing area going forward. We're going to see continued cluster of the particular population. We look over to the West Coast, or pretty much our sixth, final big population cluster region. It's just essentially the entire coast. Now that's kind of misleading because the entire coast is, it takes you, 20 hours just to drive from one end to the other. But nonetheless, you see this dense cluster all along the Pacific coast, from Vancouver to Seattle to Portland to San Francisco down to Los Angeles and San Diego. Now when we zoom into our area of the country, we can really see this population clusters, especially near coastlines or along waterways. And so much of that eastern coast there, along the Atlantic coast from Boston all the way down to Washington, D.C., is because of the access to the Atlantic Ocean. If we think about when those cities originate, when those really flourish, when they come to be, obviously before the railroad, before automobiles, and so when waterways and shipping were absolutely critical. We go more into the interior, that makes sense as far as Chicago, Detroit, Toronto, and those other cities that are along the large waterways in terms of the Great Lakes. When we think about some of the interior places like Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, St. Louis, that aren't along a coastline, why do they come to be? Why do we see population clusters there? Because of the role of rivers. And so those are all cities that have a large enough river. And so once again, waterways, especially big enough waterways to move goods, to move people from one place to another, which is how those places came to be. Then places in cities like, for example, Indianapolis, Columbus, Ohio, they really came to flourish because of the role of railroads. You go to both of those cities, you're not going to find a navigable waterway. Indianapolis does not have a waterway in which you can actually move goods, people, what have you. And so Indianapolis came to be with the role of the railroad. And so the railroad was a transformative as far as tools to move people around, but it really then created these opportunities for cities that weren't along a major waterway, weren't along a major coastline, to then come and develop. Today, of course, with transportation mechanisms being airplane and automobile, this has all further changed the game, and so people can live farther and farther away from these traditional places in which populations clusters have always been along major coastlines and waterways. And now we zoom into Indiana, we can further see population density and population clusters and understand where people live in Indiana. And so what we have is different geography levels, and so once again, this is using the terms aggregation. So on the far right, we aggregate the biggest geography, the county level, and on the far left, townships, we aggregate to the smallest geography, a township. And so essentially we can see specifically where populations are clustered. And in the middle, we have school districts. And of course, this all plays a key role in funding and all of that stuff when we look at K through 12. But we're not going to talk about that right now. When we look at where people live in Indiana, we're going to see a large population there around Indianapolis. Indianapolis is by far the largest city in the state of Indiana. And so subsequently is where we're going to find higher densities clustered around that. And especially in those counties that surround it. We can see those counties that surround it, especially on the left-hand map, we can see closer you are to Marion County in Indianapolis, the more likely you are to see higher population clusters. Other places in which you note where Indiana citizens live is along waterways. And so at the top of the map, especially there along Lake Michigan, and so a major waterway, obviously. And so that's going to come up when we look at the economics of that particular region of the state. It's going to be heavily reliant on shipping and production. When we go down to the southern part of the state, we see population clusters there along the Ohio River. And so we think about the White River, West or East Fork. For the most part, the Wabash River, those aren't rivers in which you're going to be able to move stuff. But the one river in Indiana that you can, the Ohio River, of course, you're going to see a dense population cluster there. So when we look at Indiana, we can kind of take these big picture ideas, clusters along waterways, but also we can see how Indianapolis is a huge area in terms of where people live in this beautiful state.